it is our custom to ask one of our honored guests to speak on behalf of our medalists. This year, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Maxine Burkett.
As a Jamaican by birth, it's nice to add to the medal count, so I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. President Falk, fellow medalists, and alumni, trustees, faculty, family, and friends in the class of 2017, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and during this amazing celebration. Before I begin, I do want to say a special aloha to my husband, Josh, and our kids, Meridian and Taino, who could not make the journey from the Pacific, but who are very much here in spirit. And I'd like to thank my sister, class of 1994, who let her little sister visit, sit in on classes, and observe the deep relationships she was forging here at Williams. And my parents, thank you for braving 4 more years of the Taconic Parkway. And most important, as immigrants, for sacrificing and putting our well-being above your own. This is an incredible, incredible honor. I have such deep affection for this institution and what it strives to be, that being an alumna alone has fueled a sense of pride and a drive to be equally excellent and continually striving for more meaningful impact. When I received the letter from President Falk about the medal just a few months ago, I about fell out of my chair. I am still under the illusion that my own commencement was just like a few months back. I'm only beginning to discover who I want to be when I grow up, and the contribution I hope to make at full maturity. I am grateful, and I promise that I will continue to work to earn this recognition. I'm also deeply humbled to be here with this illustrious group. Beyond the luster, this group would be my ideal set of companions on a deserted island. We could literally colonize Mars, mind you. Elliot would tutor us on how to grow our own food organically in all kinds of weather. We might discover new endemic species with Bruce's guidance. We would avoid the miserable maze of suburban sprawl as Jeff crafts a smart, walkable deserted island for the 5 of us. And with Sharon Burke's deep experience and expertise in energy and security, we could transform all manner of inputs into renewable energy resources. To be perfectly honest, I would in fact be the least useful to all of you, unless we can find a way to fertilize crops with dusty law review articles or fuel the grid with PowerPoint presentations. I can do that very, very well. But in all seriousness, my life on islands, from my beginning in Jamaica to my present on Oahu, has provided a unique perspective on the limitations as well as the possibilities that undeniable finiteness presents. And that seems to be the tie that binds the 2016 recipients, understanding the dangers and vulnerabilities, but also the sheer beauty and opportunity for transcendence that finiteness unforgivingly presents. When President Falk invited me to speak at this convocation, he offered that I might reflect on my time at Williams and how it influenced my current work. My charge is in some small way to help you in your senior year think about what comes next and how to use this last year to prepare for it. 3 themes quickly emerged as I reflected on my last year. First was establishing one's place in the Williams ecosystem. Next was building one's resilience. And then finally, facing and ultimately embracing uncertainty. So like my senior year, the remainder of my remarks will unfold in these 3 parts. And I'd like to do some of this work by invoking another alumnus, James A. Garfield, class of 1856, and the 20th President of the United States, whom I will say was a remarkably complex man. Deeply imperfect, to be sure, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on, but he was one whose life, and all that it might have meant for our political economy post-slavery, was far too abbreviated. He died 135 years ago, September 19th, 1881, almost 7 generations ago, come Monday. I will admit sheepishly that I've just recently learned most of what I know about this Republican of yesteryear. I've taken to consuming podcasts eagerly and obsessively, my husband might argue. While living in DC this past summer, I stumbled upon Presidential, which explores the character and legacy of each president in 44 episodes. I would drop my son and daughter at the day camps at the Smithsonian Museums. I'd pop in my earbuds. I'd walk briskly across the mall between the Capitol and the Washington Monument to my left to the offices of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd always wanted to take the poli-sci course on presidents as part of my major, but ran out of time in my schedule. This was a quick and dirty and altogether titillating proxy. Perhaps the greatest lesson I gleaned from the narratives up through the 20th president was that with respect to some of the most morally challenging and character-defining questions in American history, a better path and its advocates had always been present. In fact, the notion that deeply consequential transgressions like centuries of slavery and the profound dissonance of some of our most revered leaders could be explained away as the conduct of a man of his time is somewhat of a disservice to their contemporaries, who were bold, despite ridicule and rancor. As to slavery, President Garfield, a man who hid runaway slaves, was a thoughtful, heart-driven general in the Union Army and a passionate advocate for freedmen. He was one of those bold forebearers. Garfield once said, "A brave man is a man who dares to look the devil in the face and tell him he is a devil." This actually speaks to my early experience at Williams and to the importance of finding one's place within the Williams ecosystem. The devil was no one person, of course, but a metaphor for a dominant culture. As much as I loved Williams, I was forced to be clear-eyed about others' notions of my place in it. Many of my classmates and I in the racial and socioeconomic minority were almost just by our presence disruptive. Candidly, it was at times a difficult few years as a young woman of color, forced to prove my intelligence and the validity of outside stories. Now, I'm not a man, and I often unwittingly back into bravery, but there were many occasions in which it was necessary to look and tell. A vivid memory was in response to an ardent Charles Murray advocate in a public economics class I took my sophomore year, by far the most emotionally challenging year of the four. To accept Murray's research and the passion with which it was asserted would be to accept my biological inferiority, that I was somehow less smart than every other person in that class, which I refused to accept and which was empirically untrue. I was the only one in that class to push back and felt profoundly alone in that moment. As I opened the door of the lecture hall, I fought to remember that I was part of another equally valid culture that was also Williams, one with a deep lineage, one to which even Garfield, the last president to be born in a log cabin in abject poverty, and Gaius Bolin, our college's first Black graduate, would attest. By the time I returned to Williamstown for my junior year at Oxford, my authentic place in the larger Williams ecosystem was cemented. My last year was the most focused, the most academically successful, and the most clarifying as to the network of students and faculty that nourished and embraced diversity and inclusivity, and the notion of our excellence as a result of them. That senior year also helped to build resilience, as ecologists might say, to maintain my capacity to adapt naturally to stress and change in the face of, say, youthful but suboptimal choices, ill-timed breakups, student debt, those sorts of details. I was at the same time assembling building blocks for my future, but not the typical ones. I did not, for example, take the full array of environmental studies courses despite my passion for the subject, and that was in part because at that time, the classes didn't speak to the equity and toxics concerns that were most dear to me. But true to the liberal arts ethos, I didn't have to take those environmental studies classes exclusively. Indeed, art studio courses and a political science major have proven themselves directly relevant to the thorny issues inherent in the climate crisis. Inspiration, creativity, and ability to understand and respond to the vagaries of human decision-making at the individual level on up are arguably the most critical skills for the task at hand. Again, Garfield's words frame the challenge well. In the settling dust of the post-war period, he explained, "I'm trying to do two things, dare to be a radical and not be a fool," which, if I may judge by the exhibitions around me, is a matter of no small difficulty, close quote. To be clear, the kind of radicalism I've sought is to imagine and help create a world in which, like healthy ecosystems, we shun waste and celebrate efficiency, that we not only see the value but understand the profound necessity of diversity of all kinds for long-term resilience, that we remain attuned and responsive to the needs of our local communities, and that we will evolve, not only to survive, but so that each of us may have an opportunity to flourish. Despite confidence in that content of that radical vision, and despite decades of preparation gilded by a Williams degree, I remember the evening after my commencement in 1998. I was back at our off-campus house on Moreland Street, and I was petrified. I had no idea what was next. I was facing a great degree of uncertainty, an unending pit, an abyss in my stomach, And a testament to the degree of safety and support Williams provides, I was for the first time in 4 years completely unsure of my next step. I hated the feeling, had zero desire to explore it, and sought to plan, sketch, and erect my way out of it. I made some headway, but clearly not enough. Fast forward 18 years to May of this year, I was sitting in one of the trendiest farm-to-table restaurants in Honolulu with Malene Lunden, a Danish woman who, along with her husband, is revered in renewable energy circles for transitioning a tiny island at latitude 55.8 degrees north to total self-sufficiency. Exhausted by the daily, unceasing barrage of bad news that is typical for those of us who work in the climate change field, I asked her how she maintained her very evident optimism. She looked at me warmly and said, "Without a doubt, the systems we have erected will collapse. And as they do, you must look at it with curiosity." It was quite zen, perhaps too zen for me even at that moment, and still today, I often find myself simply looking down the abyss of a changing planet. Yet her encouragement to remain curious was a beautiful invitation to face and embrace uncertainty. As we all seek to gain insight on what comes next and how to prepare for it, a healthy dose of curiosity is critical. Author Mary Pfeiffer, in her uplifting article titled "Wake Up, Our World is Dying and We're All in Denial," eloquently wrote, "In our great hominid journey, no one really knows what time it is. We could be at its end, or we could be at the beginning of a great and glorious turning." It's true, we have no real idea where we are in the arc of human history. Convocation speeches, I am sure, are meant to be filled with words of hope and assurances that your future will be bright. I would be dishonest if I unequivocally said that was the case. Yes, with the privilege of a Williams education, your future will no doubt be brighter, but it is all painfully relative. We are at the brink of crushing heat and steady 500-year storms. We are witnessing the reemergence of zombie diseases released by the thawed remains of reindeer as permafrost melts, islands that are simultaneously thirsty and drowning, overwashed megacities, and the disassembled communities and countries that come along with it. I say this to you not to be rendered the bleakest convocation speaker in our college's long history, but to look at this devil and name it. We've made a series of poor decisions with our dependence on fossil fuels, and we frustratingly continue to ignore the bright and bold voices who counsel against it. Conventional wisdom even diagnoses this as the human condition, as though the Anthropocene was inevitable, and this was the inescapable result of the actions of men and women of their time. We've had a tendency to ridicule, marginalize, and name the fool those who've argued for alternative futures. And perhaps most relevant to you today, we've forgotten the significance of our individual voice and role in the larger geophysical and geopolitical system. Fellow medalist Sharon Burke's review of a Norwegian political thriller on climate change provides a significant and relevant perspective. The thriller, she says, is not really about geopolitical brinksmanship or climate change, but the small moral compromises individuals make and how that aggregates into collective choices and ultimately national character. The series is more of a social critique, albeit a loving one, and a more general observation of human nature under pressure. There's no singular nor prescribed response to pressure. All of you, from your spaces of unique brilliance, can fashion your individual future in a manner that is clear-eyed about those pressures, yet respects and honors your place in a larger ecosystem. I urge you, as you make your plans, to ask yourself not only how you or others might benefit from your success, but also who will suffer. What is your contribution to the character of nations? How will you build your legacy? How will you become an ancestor that future generations thrive because of, not under the weight of? Will you be a man or woman of your time, or change the times you live in? In an 1874 speech to the House of Representatives, James Garfield said, "Things don't turn up in this world until somebody turns them up." Class of 17, now's the time to turn it up. And do so this time not by addressing one injustice and remaining blind to all others, but by understanding the ways in which numerous injustices are interwoven inextricably. I mentioned earlier that I would return to Garfield's complexity. Being a Williams alum, I knew that a podcast alone could never tell the full story. I kept reading and researching to learn more about the fellow Eve, becoming ever more inspired by his lofty words. And to my heartbreak, but sadly not quite to my surprise, I learned that Garfield, while notable in his intentions vis-a-vis newly freed slaves, was more of a man of his time when it came to the Indian question. In reading through this more shameful history, I could not help but think of the many indigenous communities who today, 7 generations later, remain at the front lines of extirpation. Whether they're at the oil pipelines in North Dakota or the rapidly eroding coastlines in the deltas of Louisiana, coastal Washington state, or towns like Shishmaref, Alaska, that just last month voted and made the painful decision to move to firmer ground. I sat and struggled with trying to reconcile Garfield's hortatory words with his at best qualified actions and pretty significant blind spot. Yet it seemed worthwhile to engage with those words and to explore that eerie and ubiquitous dissonance that impairs visionary people and their institutions. And trust me, it's quite relevant to you in your final year at Williams. Your senior year provides an opportunity to lay the groundwork, to find your place in the world's ecosystem, to explore and challenge that dissonance, and to face uncertainty with a resilient plan and a healthy dose of curiosity. Now, before I close, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the college's struggles with the divestment question. I think you can likely gather where I fall on this. While I know that one school's decision on the matter is not the linchpin to decarbonizing our global economy, I also do not diminish the collective strength of small acts or underestimate the violence that facially neutral investment portfolios can meet on struggling and disproportionately impacted communities in our country and across the globe. The speed and magnitude of climate change means we must use all the tools we have and turn up a good deal more. I think as students and as alumni, it is a welcome responsibility to lovingly prod, encourage, model, unveil blind spots for our institutions so that we can be unqualifiedly understood as among the most visionaries 7 generations hence. So as one who is eternally grateful for the education and now the recognition that I've received from Williams, I'm committed to being a partner in this journey. I am with you all along the way. To the class of 17, I look to all of you and maintain a deep optimism and healthy curiosity about your next steps. I'm so very eager to see what you will do. Thank you.